Hello and welcome to Track Changes. Starting from November 10, more than 50,000 people from almost 200 countries will start to arrive in the Brazilian city of Belem, which is the gateway city to the vast Amazonian rainforest. You might wonder why so many people feel a need to go to a UN summit, which is ultimately about one issue: climate change. But the thing is, climate change affects almost every part of our lives, our livelihoods, and our planet. And that means a lot of different aspects of climate change need to be discussed at the COP. At COP30, issues to be discussed include shifting our energy, industrial, and transport systems away from climate-changing and climate-disrupting pollution. They also include protecting forests, oceans, and biodiversity. And they include making sure our farming and food systems are sustainable and fair. They also include making sure our cities, infrastructure, and water are resilient to climate change and climate disruption. And they include encouraging human and social development, because the changes we need to make if we're to conserve our way of life and our planet can only happen if people are treated fairly. And finally, layered across all these separate issues is the issue of ensuring there is the finance and technology to make it all happen. In this episode, we're going to get some nitty-gritty, informed analysis from two senior journalists with news services Carbon Pulse and Biodiversity Pulse, Allison Gacad and Mark Tilley. Allison is North America editor with Carbon Pulse, and Mark is the Carbon Pulse Asia Pacific editor. Before we go into the chat, there's a bit of terminology that will help you get the most out of it. You'll hear a reference to the TFFF. It stands for the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, which will be launched at the COP, providing payments for keeping tropical forests intact. You'll also hear a reference to REDD+, which is a long-standing initiative that has a somewhat similar goal and which stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. As well, you'll hear a reference to NDCs. These are crucial documents. They're the international climate change action pledges and plans that each country develops and shares with other countries via the UN. NDC stands for Nationally Determined Contribution. And if you've ever wondered what COP stands for, it stands for Conference of the Parties. Okay, let's hear from Allison and Mark. Allison, Mark, welcome back to Track Changes.
Happy to be here.
Thanks, Mari.
COP30 starts soon on November 10, running through to November 21. In the lead up to this year's summit, has there been anything different about the way the Brazilian COP presidency has approached preparing for it?
Yeah, I'm happy to start off on this question, and I'll bring it back to the mid-year climate talks in Bonn.
Yep.
That's where it felt like Brazil hard launched their COP30 presidency of sorts, in the sense of that was the first multilateral UN climate talks that took place this year with Brazil as COP president. That was also the first instance where the US was completely out of the picture. So I think there was an expectation really on Brazil's part to show up to that conference in Bonn with a strong sense of leadership. And really the image and I guess stance that they put out there was that they wanted this COP to be a COP of implementation and action. And we've seen that time and time again. They've issued several letters to the general public describing essentially what they're targeting for this COP, and often it has some kind of phrasing around implementation and action and truth. And there's a pragmatic reason behind that, in the sense of, it's been 10 years since the Paris Agreement was finalized in 2015. And most of the key items from the Paris Agreement have been agreed upon, essentially. There are still a few outstanding things that, personally, I don't follow too closely, but the big ticket climate finance, carbon market items that we've been following closely have largely been agreed on, at least in principle. And I think that's why Brazil has really taken the stance of, okay, we need to focus on implementation because we've done enough talking. And so I think that Brazil as a COP presidency has tried to position itself as the implementation COP, but that remains to be seen. And I think the expectations are high on that front for sure.
You mentioned the action COP and the COP of truth. What are they trying to contrast themselves with, with respect to previous COPs? Where do you get the impression that they think previous COPs have failed to deliver?
Most recent, if we're looking at the most recent COP, COP29 in Baku, hosted by the Azerbaijani presidency, from the perspective of finance, many stakeholders regarded that COP as a failure of sorts. The reason being is because there was a climate finance goal that was agreed upon in kind of the final hours in the overtime of COP that many developing nations and civil society organizations weren't happy with. The outcome was less than, I don't have the exact numbers on me right now, but developing nations were looking for billions of dollars in climate finance funding to flow from developed nations, and that wasn't agreed upon. It was only in the hundreds of billions. And so because of that, many civil society organizations and developing nations look to that COP as a failure. And I think Brazil, identifying as a developing nation, wanted to carry, or I guess change their perspective perhaps of what it looks like for finance to flow to developing nations that are suffering from the impacts of climate change. And it's interesting because they haven't necessarily taken the language of that climate finance goal from COP29 and ran with it into COP30. They've kind of proposed a different mechanism to go about it. The main one that we've seen is called the Tropical Forests Forever Fund, or the Tropical Forests Forever Facility, or TFFF for short. That's the acronym you'll see going about. And that appears to be a primary finance mechanism that Brazil's been pouring its energy into. Okay, we recognize that the climate finance target that happened last year at COP29 wasn't sufficient, and it wasn't something that nations were happy with. But here's this new adjacent to COP finance mechanism that we're rallying a lot of support for, and we're working really hard to get some agreements too. And now let's see if we can get it executed. I'll pause there for now, but I'm happy to speak more to
Sure.
TFFF.
Okay.
It's quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be good to come back to that, definitely. So let me ask, what important pieces of the puzzle have already been released ahead of the start of the COP? I'm thinking there in particular of things like the nationally determined contributions that countries have had to make and so on. What have we seen ahead of this COP occurring that is particularly important?
So I can take that. Nationally determined contributions, or NDCs as they're known, have updated emissions reductions targets. It's not necessarily going to be, these NDCs aren't going to be on the negotiating table at COP, but they do present an important signal on those themes of implementation and how countries are actually going to start to bend that curve in terms of cutting emissions. Unfortunately, in the run-up to COP this year, the UNFCCC and the presidency Belem put out multiple deadlines for countries to submit NDCs, but they kept on having to push them back. So at first the deadline was in February, and then it was then it got pushed to September. And so as of now, only roughly around 60 countries out of 180 have submitted their post-2030 targets.
Oh, really? I didn't realize there was so few.
Yeah, and there's some pretty stark vacancies, I suppose you could say, so far. So Europe, which is obviously is seen to be and likes to present itself as a international leader on climate change, They have yet to formally submit an NDC. There's been a lot of infighting between member states regarding that, but they have put forward an indicative target to cut emissions by 66 to 72% by 2035, roughly. However, there is some bright spots, relatively speaking, I suppose. So China, which is obviously the world's largest emitter, they have submitted an NDC to reduce economy-wide emissions by 7 to 10% from peak levels. It's been described as a bit lackluster, and some of the language in the NDC is a bit ambiguous, but there is some pretty big moves there to sort of targets in terms of expanding its renewable energy capacity, even more so than it has already. And it's seen as like a really strong signal that China is very much wanting to sort of actively contribute to reducing emissions, whereas before I think it's been a bit ambiguous. And it's also the first time that the country has included a definitive economy-wide emissions reduction target as part of an NDC. So there is some room for optimism there, perhaps.
Yeah.
Other big polluters like Indonesia, who just recently put forward their updated NDCs. There's a big focus on forest protection and carbon sinks from their forests. India has yet to submit its own nationally determined contribution. And then obviously there's the largely felt absence from the US, which has obviously exited from the agreement.
Yes. Okay. Well, let me ask you. You mentioned there China and you mentioned India. China, India, Brazil. They're all BRIC countries, so-called, part of the BRIC alliance of countries, which also includes Russia. But we can leave that aside. Does the fact that they have this economic grouping or this sort of alliance, do you think that's going to prove useful in the COP process, in activating India and China to do more, maybe, or to open some channels of communication that perhaps in previous COPs haven't been open?
It might not necessarily. Yeah, it might not necessarily open for more channels of communications, but it potentially, those countries' influence, I think, will definitely be felt a lot more perhaps this time around, given that, we're still yet to see Europe's NDC submitted. There's some division there. They put forward, intentions and positions on negotiations. But then also, I guess the US's absence might potentially mean that those BRICS nations will be able to drive the negotiations in a direction that they would like, that's more pleasing to them, perhaps.
Yeah.
At the same time,
I could speak. Sorry, I'll let you finish.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, the US.
Go ahead, Allison.
Give us your thoughts, Allison, because you've been tracking US developments very closely.
Yeah, so the US absence is interesting because I think a lot of people were wondering what would happen to the power dynamics at the climate negotiating table with the US out of the picture. Given that obviously under the Biden administration, the Obama administration, there was such a strong focus around emissions reductions and multilateralism. And now with the Trump administration, obviously that's all out the door. And now with the absence of the US, we're seeing China play a little bit of a stepped up role in advocating for multilateralism. As Mark pointed out, we saw that when China first announced its updated NDC at the UN General Assembly, where President Xi Jinping himself, although over video, said that we need to preserve multilateralism and we need to continue the climate fight even if a country is against it. And he said country singular.
Yeah, right.
That was translated. Now that being said, going back to your question around cooperation between the BRICS countries, Brazil holding the COP presidency and as the host of COP is interesting in this regard because Brazil and China for example, share some key interests when it comes to climate. The first being on the elements of trade. Both of them are potentially quite exposed to the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is essentially a carbon tariff on goods from other countries if those countries themselves don't have a carbon price. Now, that being said, both China and Brazil have emissions trading schemes, carbon markets in the works, but that's still something that when it comes to trade, they're quite wary of. The second element as well is on forests and finance. I think both China and Brazil share an interest in advancing efforts to halt deforestation, and China's committed, in word at least, to Brazil's TFFF forest financing mechanism. So we are seeing some cooperation there. But I think for me, what's most interesting is that China is, with the U.S. out of the picture, what I've noticed is China starting to steer the climate negotiations towards trade rather than emissions reductions. And given that China's technologies are so heavily tariffed by several nations around the world, that there is a clear interest there in steering discussions toward trade of solar panels and EVs, for example, rather than direct emissions reductions, and looking at its kind of lackluster NDC, as Mark pointed out, that some have said that makes a lot of sense.
So how could that play out, that stronger focus on trade?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting because, and this is my first thought at it, Mark, feel free to speak to this after. It's not necessarily an official item on the negotiating agenda, although it always seems to come up at every COP. When it comes to discussing the agenda and all climate summits past in recent years, there's always been one nation that's brought up the idea of unilateral trade measures, and that's synonymous with countries that are upset with, practically speaking, carbon tariffs that have been placed on goods that they're producing. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that somehow came up on the COP agenda, although it isn't formally featured as of yet, but somehow it always does. Yeah.
Yeah, it always seems to come up as part of sort of the back channel negotiations. Sometimes you hear of these unilateral trade measures kind of gets sort of brought up as kind of sticking points in sort of across the negotiation tracks during the COPs. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily always seem to come up on it's not necessarily part of the official agenda, as Allison said, but it is often used as sort of as a brinksmanship sort of negotiating tactic when they're trying to sort of get larger items through consensus during the talks throughout the 2 weeks, it seems.
Okay, so if Australia does announce a CBAM at the talks, we shouldn't expect a too strong a round of applause from Brazil and China.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you asked that. Australia's COP delegation will be giving a briefing tomorrow about its positions on various items for COP. But it's unclear at this stage whether they will take the route of implementing a CBAM. They had this a completed review that was conducted last year and early this year in front of them, but Australia's Climate Change Minister, Chris Bowen, told a conference a couple of months ago that a decision on that hasn't been made yet. So yeah, unclear at this stage whether Australia will make an announcement like that.
Yeah, okay. So let me ask you, are there any unique features about this COP, about what will be discussed and about what countries are expected to do at the COP or, talk about at the COP? And maybe, Allison, do you want to take that one first up?
I can start off with TFFF. We're definitely expecting to see some announcements on that front. So I guess just to set the stage, so TFFF, Tropical Forest Forever Fund or facility, it's essentially a blended forest finance fund that looks to support developing nations with their efforts to stop deforestation. It's a very ambitious fund. It's targeting $125 billion over 2 decades and looking to flow that finance directly to developing countries. In theory, 20% of that funding go to Indigenous peoples. And the investment would come from a mix of donor governments and philanthropy. So they're targeting about $25 billion of that to come from those two entities broadly. And then then that 25 billion would then back or guarantee $100 billion in bonds to institutional investors. And then that would then enable the finance to flow to developing nations. So it's a really interesting, unique, like quite sophisticated financing mechanism that, in theory, they're projecting returns of up to 3% for investors. But again, these are the early stages of kind of setting the stage and expectations. So it's understandable that they want to set the bar as high as possible.
Yeah.
Some countries have made commitments in word to the fund. So, for example, China has said that it'll pay into the fund. We're expecting to see likely more nations come on board.
Yeah, Indonesia has also been one to pledge its commitment, but in words rather than in a formal written declaration at this stage.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question on that front of, who is going to be paying in, who's going to be paid out. So probably some more clarity on that front. But yeah, lots of questions around timing, who are the philanthropies that are going to be on board, who are the institutional investors. The World Bank is going to be the main trustee or like holder of the fund. But otherwise, that's kind of high level what we know about TFFF.
And this might be a dumb question, but what's the interplay between the TFFF and carbon markets?
Yeah, in one of the early concept notes, so one of the early foundational philosophical documents that TFFF released, they did have a section on REDD+, although they didn't necessarily, it would just kind of described it as complementary to REDD+ efforts, but not necessarily substituting one or the other. So it does seem like this is a distinct mechanism for flow of finance, where they're looking for direct payment effectively of like $4 per hectare of forest that isn't deforested.
Yep.
So I'd say it probably operates adjacent or in parallel to carbon markets, yeah.
Okay, well, let's do a bit of a deep dive on some of the issues that need to be dealt with. And let's start with emissions reductions. Assuming a lot more countries have actually submitted their NDCs by the time that COP starts, what might we see on this front? Where will the negotiations themselves at COP be focused in terms of emissions reductions? Mark, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, I think most of that focus on emissions reductions will be framed via the global stocktake that was agreed on at COP28 in Dubai a couple of years ago, which was where countries agreed to transition away from fossil fuels and then triple renewable energy capacity and double energy efficiency by 2030 for those specific renewable energy and energy efficiency goals. So I think a lot of how countries are trying to channel that or articulate that emissions reduction goal is in relation to the global stocktake. There's a few NDCs that have been submitted that directly refer to the global stocktake and how their updated climate targets and policies align with the global stocktake. So it's about sort of how is that specifically implemented? But of course, that global stocktake was very contentious around that fossil fuel phase out language because there were multiple countries that were very much trying to hold off on that. I think there was some language in the text at the time as well, which also acknowledged the role that bridging fuels would play as part of that global stock take pledge, which many sort of believed it was a very sort of obvious nod to the LNG industry.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it'll be one of the more contentious items on the agenda of how countries are trying to align themselves with that pledge.
Do you think Brazil has the stomach, I guess, to really take up that issue of a phase down in fossil fuels? Or are they, I mean, is that to some extent going to be in the too hard basket for these talks?
I think they'll definitely be more ambitious about it than, say, Azerbaijan was last year when they hosted it. So, but that's a pretty that's not the highest bar to clear, perhaps. Given the language that they've been using very much about sort of it being an implementation COP, it would be remiss of them to not wanting to tackle that global stock take fossil fuel phase out pledge. So, but yeah, Allison might have more to say on that.
Yes, Allison. Is it going to be tropical forests forever and fossil fuels forever? I mean, what do you think we might see?
Yeah, the wouldn't be too far off in the sense of what we've seen news-wise. About the same time as these TFFF discussions have advanced, Brazil's also approved licenses to oil companies to drill for more oil in the Amazon. Arguably, that's, to Brazil's state-owned oil company, Petrobras. But nonetheless, that doesn't go unseen by COP observers. For sure that Brazil is continuing to approve fossil fuel development while hosting its climate talks. And that's been an ongoing theme the past few years of COPs being held in petrostates. And the Brazil's COP president, Andrea Correa do Lago, said that, this is evidence of the fact that this is the energy transition in real time. It doesn't change Brazil's position at COP30, but it's just proof that this is a transition. We use oil today. We're going to continue to use oil. And as a developing nation, it's an economic challenge for us to transition away or transition away from fossil fuels and phase out, phase down. We'll see what kind of definitive language Brazil's willing to uphold based on the global stock take. But it is important to keep that real world context amid the negotiations, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on to finance, which is a crucial issue and one that you've been following closely, Allison. What needs to happen on that front? What might happen on that front?
Yeah, I guess I've already spoken to the kind of parallel outside of official negotiating text TFFF. When it comes to more negotiated outcomes, there's one element called the Baku to Belem 1.3 trillion roadmap. And so that was an outcome of COP29. As I mentioned, just many nations, civil society not happy with the climate finance goals and outcome. And so this kind of concession of statement was that, okay, we're going to work on this roadmap to 1.3 trillion. How do we mobilize 1.3 trillion in climate finance? That it hasn't looked promising so far. The last discussions on it at the mid-year climate talks in Bonn were a lot of presentations around kind of foundational philosophies of what the roadmap should look like, but it hasn't exactly translated into commitments and action, even in the lead up to COP in terms of, for example, pre-COP meetings, and nothing really has formalized materially out of this roadmap. That's a huge concern for civil society organizations. What I've heard is that, this is something that they want to keep alive at the negotiating table, because it is something where civil society in developing nations can put their foot down and say, hey, this is how we want things to go, versus something like the TFFF that takes place outside of the UN consensus mechanisms and outside of the official COP negotiating text. So you see kind of the leverage that certain stakeholders are trying to play with regards to this element of climate finance. But this COP is interesting because there isn't even just overall a cover decision as of yet, or a big negotiated outcome that people are looking for. Because as we said, it's 10 years out from the Paris Agreement, and most big things have been agreed upon. So on the finance front, yeah, I'd say those are the two main things that I'm watching.
It is frustrating. I mean, when you say that they're still talking about foundational philosophies, that's kind of a chilling phrase for anybody who wants to see rapid progress on this front, I guess. And it does seem like various groupings have come up with sensible solutions that could raise significant funds. I'm thinking of things like the Bridgetown Initiative that I think is it Maya Motley has spearheaded a lot of work on that front, I think in conjunction with France, and suggested various international levies that could be imposed to raise funds. But basically it's a watch this space and don't be too hopeful. Is that correct?
I guess it's one that when it comes to this COP, there's expectation on a lot of the outside of COP outcomes, it feels like. So it will be interesting to see how countries deliver on those fronts in terms of carbon market deals, for example, on Article 6, and commitments to finance. But in terms of, material, and Mark can probably speak to this better, material emissions reductions. Personally, I would be keen to see tangible strategies from countries regarding their NDCs in terms of what does that emissions trajectory actually look like? What are they actually going to decarbonize? But it seems like countries are more keen to announce markets and perhaps initiatives that they're going to contribute to, rather than perhaps decarbonization and emissions reductions, things that perhaps they have to take away.
Yes.
So my expectations are tempered on that front for sure.
Okay. Mark, I
Yeah,
might ask... Oh, sorry. Go on. Yep.
I was just going to say, there's efforts sort of bilaterally to the COP process as well, where countries or groups of countries have basically decided to take matters into their own hands to be able to sort of raise finance on their own, because they've found the processes undertaken by the UN to be too slow and too complex and too cumbersome, unreliable. So an example of this is the Pacific Finance Facility, which was launched by the Pacific Island Forum, which is made up of Pacific nations, and it was basically came from a place of frustration that the mechanisms that were in play was inadequate. And I guess it sort of speaks to the broader theme at the moment of that sort of fracturing of global multilateralism that we've seen in the last year or so, where sort of countries and regions are basically going on their own journey to try and solve the problems and the funding issues that they want to address.
I guess, and I think the Pacific facility that you mentioned is part of this. But Mark, did you want to talk about COP30 and adaptation and resilience issues? What we're likely to see happen on those fronts?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit on the loss and damaged funds.
Yep.
So there hasn't, I think, been as big an uptake to it as what was initially hoped. And yeah, I think there's still debate going on about who contributes, who receives funding. So it's similar issues that are being raised with that have yet to gain clarity with the TFFF. Is an ongoing issue with loss and damage. it seems, at this stage.
Okay. In general terms, then, having just run through some of those issues, what needs to happen for this COP to be judged a success? And do you get a sense that people are cautiously optimistic about it, or is there sort of fear and trepidation? Allison, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think success will be measured against effectively the COP presidency's own words of implementation and action. I think that observers are really looking for material commitments, whether that's in finance or emissions reductions, either in the lead up to COP or at COP itself. And I think whether countries will deliver that on the basis of Brazil's leadership, I think is something that a lot of people are watching.
Yeah. Okay. And Mark, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key success milestones would likely to ensure that the COP process stays active and alive and sort of is actively seen to be actually doing what it's being set out to achieve. Yeah, I feel like the Brazilian presidency will be under a lot of pressure to get good outcomes from the COP, more so than previous ones, basically to demonstrate that these multilateral cooperation processes can still work and still deliver results, especially with the backdrop of multiple parties and scientists and experts saying basically it's going to be impossible now to keep global temperatures below 1.5. And the issue of the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement as well, and is also and the fact that it is taking a much more aggressive stance in trying to sort of dismantle these multilateral programs and to try and tackle emissions. We saw just a few weeks ago that the US was successful at stalling the International Maritime Organization's framework to reduce emissions in the shipping sector to next year. So they basically been successful at kicking that can down the road. So yeah, I think it feels like it's going to be very much a make or break COP, as they always are, and as they're always sort of espoused to be. But given obviously it's been 10 years since the Paris Agreement, and there's all this language around sort of this is an implementation COP, sort of this is where the rubber is supposed to hit the road. It seems like it needs to come out with some really substantial outcomes, I feel.
Yeah. Okay. I've only got one more question, but before I go to that, is there anything else any other points that either of you wanted to make?
I was just going to say a unique element of this COP this year is the setting of it, the location.
Yeah. Yeah.
Given that it's in Belem, which is this city in Brazil's northeast. It's very close to the Amazon, and it's about a million people, so it's relatively small. And yeah, there's been a lot of angst over the last year about whether the city has the capacity and the physical sort of space to be able to host an event of this size. There's been a lot of reports of sort of potentially delegates having to share rooms or even share beds, because there's just there seems to be there could be a potential lack of accommodation options. There were a lot of calls for the presidency to move the venue to one of Brazil's larger cities, but they have repeatedly said over the last few months that there is no plan B. It's happening in Belem. They wanted to have it set in a city that's adjacent to the Amazon, so that I think it was so that delegates could be more in touch with the Amazon as not just physically, but as a representation of what the COP process is trying to save, I suppose.
Yeah.
We'll see how it all goes in terms of the logistics of it all when we get there in a couple of weeks.
Indeed, and all the best to you both on that front. Okay, so my final question, talking about locations, how will what happens at this COP at COP30, how will that shape what happens at COP31, which hopefully will be an Australia-Pacific COP?
Yeah, well, I guess Australia and Turkey are still in a dead heat to see who gets hosting rights next year. Multiple observers have told me that it's basically going to have to come down to some kind of vote or stunt or sort of power move in the plenary in the dying hours of this COP sort of thing. It's so because it seems like they're very much stuck in a stalemate at the moment in terms of negotiations. But if Australia is successful at hosting the COP, there's been suggestions and work by civil society to put forward an agenda for COP31, despite Australia not necessarily getting hosting rights yet, or at all. We'll see. And part of that is obviously, I think a lot of that's going to be focused on finance for the Pacific, but also there's been talk of potentially trying to, as far as implementation and emissions reductions goes, there's been proposals to put forward an idea of like a 100% renewable specific initiative, and there's also been the suggestion that the Pacific could potentially a representative from the Pacific. From a Pacific nation could be a sort of a co-president alongside Australia. Not necessarily, I think there's some bureaucratic and sort of diplomatic issues that would need to be worked out about who would actually have the power to gavel things through. But it's something that is that has been suggested by some groups as basically a way to sort of represent the Pacific as being, co-leading next year's COP with Australia. Yeah. If they do get it, we don't want to count our chickens before they hatch.
No, we certainly don't. I guess we'll have to wait and see till those final hours, that long wait. Okay, well, all the best to you both. Thanks very much for making time. I know it's an incredibly busy period for you both. And I hope the COP goes well.
Thanks so much, Murray.
Thanks very much, Murray. Great to chat.
I hope you enjoyed that chat with Allison and Mark, who will shortly be heading to Belem to pump out coverage about how the talks are progressing. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.